The period following the Civil War is known as the Reconstruction period, an 11-year period spanning the years 1865 to 1876. It's as dense and as complex as the Civil War itself was. One historian described Reconstruction as, quote, war by any other name, end of quote. Another described it as, quote, the Second Civil War. Reconstruction begins with the expansion of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in non-Union controlled territories. Congress now, after much debate, adopts a provision to test an amendment to the Constitution. It's debated for a year and resisted by the House of Representatives throughout 1864, and President Lincoln takes an active role to ensure its passage through the House by ensuring that the amendment was added to the Republican Party platform for the upcoming 1864 presidential election. By amending the Constitution, Lincoln would overcome all the constitutional problems of state jurisdiction over slavery as a domestic state issue. Lincoln's efforts will come to fruition when the House passed the bill in January of 1865. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States would require 3/4 of states to endorse it. It's proposed to the legislature of the several states by the 38th United States Congress on January 31st, 1865, and the amendment will be officially adopted on December 6th, 1865, when Georgia finally ratified the amendment, giving the required 3/4 vote of states on that issue. It's a very simple and short amendment. Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And Section 2 certainly now moves the issue of slavery into federal jurisdiction. The 13th Amendment is declared as adopted in a proclamation issued by Secretary of State William Seward on December 18th, 1865, when it had been ratified by the legislatures of 27 of the then eligible 36 states. Not all the states would ratify the 13th Amendment. The most recent ratification of the abolition of slavery came as late as 1995, 25 years ago, in Mississippi, the last of the 36 states in existence in 1865 to ratify it. Delaware, for example, will ratify the abolition of slavery in 1901, Kentucky in 1976, and Mississippi again on March 16th, 1995. Not that a failure by a state to ratify the abolition of slavery changes anything in that state. Once the sufficient majority of states adopt the amendment or any constitutional amendment, it becomes applicable in all the states, even if states had not ratified it. While the states had been debating ratification, Abraham Lincoln himself will be assassinated on April 14th in 1865, approximately a week after the war had ended, by John Wilkes Booth, the first president in the history of the United States to be assassinated. He is shot in the back of the head by the actor John Wilkes Booth in the Ford Theater as Lincoln and his wife and some guests are watching a play from a presidential booth overlooking the stage. This assassination, of course, suddenly catapults the Vice President Andrew Johnson into the presidency, a presidency that no one had anticipated, and one that Andrew Johnson was not well suited to take in hand. And Andrew Johnson will now find himself surrounded by what I would describe as a kind of pack of rabid political dogs surrounding him, each seeking its own fill of power and influence in the process of redefining a new nation. On May 29th, 1865, Johnson will issue two proclamations. The first extended Lincoln's policy of pardoning the majority of ordinary Confederates who now swore an oath to support emancipation and loyalty to the Union. However, in addition to Lincoln's exception that elite leaders of the Confederacy need to petition for specific presidential pardons, Johnson also now excluded all Confederates who owned more than $20,000 in taxable property. They too now had to petition for a specific presidential pardon. Radical Republicans liked this first proclamation, for by adding this additional category to the pardon exemption, or to the automatic pardon exemption, they saw it as a way of dismembering the Confederate plantation plutocracy, which they saw responsible for the secession and the war. The radicals, however, are going to be less happy with Johnson's other proclamation, the so-called North Carolina Proclamation, which will seem to set now the precedent for the procedure of how states will be readmitted into the Union. Johnson appoints himself a provisional governor in North Carolina who was to call an election for a constitutional convention that would establish a Republican form of government that presumably would be consistent with the American Constitution. The presumption also was that the convention would negate the secession. It would repudiate any wartime loans during the secession and would endorse the abolition of slavery. But there is no mention of the vote being granted to African Americans in the newly readmitted state. It would be entirely up to the white electorate to rebuild a new state framework in the postbellum period. Johnson will choose as governors conservative Northerners or Southern Whigs who either sat out the war or were its critics. None of these men were particularly passionate about the vote for African Americans, and were also unlikely to pursue any kind of aggressive wholesale confiscation of former rebel estates and properties. And so it seemed to many that Johnson's agenda was more focused on restoration rather than the reconstruction. And today is still lamented by some as a lost opportunity to build a more equitable society in the American South and to rebuild race relations in a new way in that territory. The argument goes that in the spring of 1865, Southerners were so defeated and demoralized and in a state of shock that Johnson could have effectively imposed stricter reconstructionist measures. Johnson's restorative strategy signaled to the South that the Union was going to limit its oppositions of measures on the defeated South, and that there was in the North a large opposition to the radical Republican agenda. And indeed, we saw throughout these lectures that there was little sympathy in the North for African American rights to vote. We saw how northern states in the antebellum period had gradually and increasingly restricted the voting rights of African Americans. The South itself was now in physical tatters. A quarter of the South's draft age males had been killed. 1 in 3 Confederate soldiers, a rate twice that of Union soldiers. Its major cities had been destroyed, vandalized, looted, burned, and gutted. A $2.7 billion investment in slaves had vanished instantly with the constitutional amendment. Church property had been damaged, denominational publishing houses destroyed, and many clergy and lay workers killed. For example, a Baptist college in Mississippi nearly lost all of its 104 faculty and nearly all of its students in the Confederate Army. And this will divide American Christianity to this day between kind of northern and southern evangelical churches that to this day there's a kind of a division and a different type of fervor between the two churches. The destruction of the cotton growing and export nexus destroyed the southern region's banking system, resulting in a shortage of credit and cash, so necessary to successfully reconstruct the South on the basis of a new free labor economy. Desperate cotton field owners lacking cash to pay freed Black laborers now entered into sharecropping arrangements, giving the workers a meager share in already a meager crop. And sharecropping, of course, historically is a condemnation to perpetual poverty, as you saw in the Seminar 2 readings. Nor were Southerners particularly responsive to the Northern radical abolitionist cry that the South had lost the war because God condemned slavery. Few Southerners saw slavery as exclusively the cause of the war in the way abolitionists did. Southern church clergy rejected Northern clergy's portrayal of them as sinners. They resented it, and they resented the calls from radical Republicans to confiscate Confederate property and try prominent Confederates for treason. There was this deep racist consensus in the South that African Americans had won nothing more than the right to work for white employers. Anything beyond that, equal rights, the right to vote, hold office, was going to be a hard sell in the South, and Johnson understood that. On August 15, Johnson indicated his desire to his appointed provisional governor in Mississippi that he wanted to see the state constitutional convention ratify the 13th Amendment and enfranchise all literate and property-owning African Americans. Johnson explained that he wanted this measure to preempt the radical Republicans, quote, who are wild upon Negro franchise, end of quote, by preempting their admissions to the readmission of Confederate states. Johnson's restoration strategy attempted to isolate radicals on both sides in favor of a broadly based conservative or moderate middle. In fact, conservative Republicans will gradually become known as moderate Republicans at this point. In August and September, Johnson ordered that all the land that had been confiscated from slave owners and prominent Confederates be now returned to them. Some of that land had been given to freed slaves under a government policy that set aside 40 acres and a mule and some barrels of corn for every former slave. Johnson canceled the homesteading program and ordered that 40,000 freed slaves be evicted from the land they had been given. Most of this land was along Sherman's march, when Sherman would distribute this land because he didn't want African American freed states tagging along with the march north. Many saw this as a betrayal, and indeed, sharecropping and these kinds of homesteading cancellations will be at part of the root of African American poverty to come. All this was fine with everybody until several southern states began returning proposed constitutions that did not renounce slavery, nor repeal their secession ordinance, nor did they repudiate the wartime debts assumed by state governments. And making things worse, some states began to enact black codes, special laws and measures intended to reintroduce some measure of control over former slaves, primarily aimed at reducing the mobility of African Americans by limiting their rights of travel or residence and increasing penalties for vagrancy and contract breaking. And contract breaking, of course, is changing your employment in the 19th century, and this applied not only to African Americans but to white workers as well. Workers didn't have the kind of freedom they have today to, if they see a better job, a better paying job or better conditions, to simply give their notice and take up a new job. Once you were employed, this was considered a contract, and you would need to have permission from your employer, whether you're black or white, to be seeking another job, essentially to be released from your contract. So this was a kind of a combination of both racism and classism in labor relations, the worst combination possible. By the winter of 1865-1866, a growing number of Republicans were now beginning to question Johnson's restorative policies. Despite Johnson's urging the southern states to ratify the 13th Amendment, Georgia went ahead and elected to the Senate the former vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. Republicans in Congress now launched an attack meant to seize from Johnson Southern Reconstruction policy, and which they saw as restorative, and now put it under the control of Congress rather than the executive office. Congress now forms the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, co-chaired by moderate Republican William Pitt Fessenden of Maine, Lincoln's appointee in 1864 to replace Salmon P. Chase, and radical Republican leader Thaddeus Stevens. Radical Republicans, led by Stevens, were calling for extraordinary federal powers to be implemented in the former Confederate states to remake race relations in them. Radicals wanted immediate and total suffrage given to freed slaves, land distribution, and occupation by federal troops to enforce these measures in the southern states by force, if necessary. And by doing so, they would have also radically remade the traditional balance of state-federal relations. Moderate Republicans like Fessenden balked at tinkering further with the constitutional balance between state and federal powers and relations and jurisdictions. They were already concerned with the tinkering done during the crisis war years, and Fessenden will say, quote, "I upheld many things then that perhaps I would not uphold now because they are not necessary." Few moderates thought that giving the vote to large numbers of illiterate ex-slaves would promote public welfare in the South, and they knew as well that the majority of Northerners were very unenthusiastic about the vote for African Americans. In many Northern states, African American rights to vote still were restricted. In the winter of 1866, Congress now, at the urging of radicals, responds by passing two bills. The Freedmen's Bureau Bill extended the life of the federal agency responsible for the education and land ownership and settlement of freed slaves. Its function was to integrate African Americans into the free labor market and society. The agency's jurisdiction under the Freedmen's Bureau Bill was now extended to civil rights issues. They also passed the Civil Rights Bill, which enforced the 13th Amendment and nullified all the newly passed state black codes, and it declared all persons born in the United States as citizens with equal rights. Federal officers were authorized to act promptly if a state failed to guarantee equal rights to all American citizens, regardless of their race. In March 1866, Johnson now begins a collision course with Congress by vetoing both these bills. Congress will now respond by overriding Johnson's veto by the required two-thirds majority. And now, with this kind of two-thirds power to veto any of to override any of Johnson's vetoes, the Joint Committee on Reconstruction will be accurately described, as it is by many historians, as the most powerful and important congressional committee in the 19th century. It essentially now took power over the post-war Southern policy of Reconstruction. Congress now drafted a 14th Amendment, which explicitly prohibited states from curtailing any citizen's constitutional rights by depriving them of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or denied them equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment prohibited former Confederates from holding federal office. It canceled the 3/5 compromise and threatened to reduce state representation in Congress of any state that denied its adult male citizens the right to vote on the basis of race. Section 1 of this amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. Section 3 of the amendment will state no one shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. Section 4 will state the validity of public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for service in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. Neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for loss or emancipation of any slaves. But all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. And here you can see from this illustration how the renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau is portrayed by the opposition as an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white men, is how it's sold. Twice vetoed by a president, but made law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Negro. Sustain the president and you protect the white man. This now, very early in the Reconstruction process, begins to kind of illustrate how these Reconstruction issues are becoming racialized in this debate. The radicals had actually wanted more. They wanted an explicit granting of franchise to all African Americans and cancellation of all Confederate rights to vote. The 14th Amendment is going to be the first article in the Constitution to make it a federal responsibility to enforce the civil rights of all citizens. During the 1866 congressional elections, Johnson had urged Southern states to reject the amendment, and it was violently disputed in the South with massacres of African Americans by white supremacists in New Orleans and in Memphis. This is the period that begins to see a rapid rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which targeted African Americans attempting to exercise their new rights and their Republican supporters. Up in the North, Republicans carefully played down the importance of African American voting rights, and this issue would not end up dominating the election. But Republican victory did not resolve the problems in the midterm elections. Between October of 1866 and January of 1867, 10 Southern legislatures rejected the 14th Amendment with Johnson's support. Enough Northern states would pass the amendment anyway, but it exposed the South to new forthcoming intervention. This kind of return of constitutions, proposed constitutions without the granting of African American voting rights, renewed a call from radical Republicans to reform the reluctant Southern society on a root and branch level. And so a revised Reconstruction Act of 1867 now placed Johnson's provisional Southern governments under direct U.S. military control, with U.S. Army commanders overseeing 5 military districts of the former Confederacy, except for Tennessee, which had ratified the 14th Amendment and had been readmitted to the U.S. Under its normal relations in 1866. U.S. military commanders in the South were empowered to protect life and property if the states failed to do so. Former Confederate office holders were now disenfranchised, and Southern states were explicitly required to enfranchise African Americans on an impartial basis. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 made it clear that as soon as Southern states ratified the 14th Amendment, this extraordinary measure would be withdrawn in that state. Under the Act, Northern states were now made exempt from granting the vote to their African American citizens because the language of the Reconstruction Act of 1867 explicitly specified that freed slaves, quote, freed slaves were to be given the vote. Non-slave African Americans in the North were not covered in these provisions. In 1867, Congress will now go head-to-head with Johnson. They'll attempt to impeach Johnson. One attempt fails, but the other succeeds. Johnson will go on trial before Congress for constitutional offenses, but he will be acquitted by one vote. And Johnson now chooses not to run for a second term in the presidential elections of 1868. The former General Ulysses S. Grant is now elected as the Republican candidate against the Democratic opponent, Horatio Seymour. Along with their candidate Grant, the Republicans continue to hold majorities both in the House and in the Senate. Ulysses S. Grant will serve 2 terms from 1868 to 1876, practically in fact, right to the end of Reconstruction. And in fact, the election will see the next president to follow Grant will signal the end of Reconstruction. And despite, Grant's reputation as this brilliant general, history's verdict on his presidency is considered, essentially, Grant is considered to be one of America's worst presidents, with an administration rife with corruption, chaos, and inefficiency. And essentially, the decline and death of Reconstruction will happen in his jurisdiction, in his presidency. The significance of the 1868 presidential election, however, is that there would be no rollback on the Republican-led Southern policy, and Southern states will not be readmitted without ratifying the 14th Amendment. In 1869, the 15th Amendment is introduced. It reads, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, as African Americans are guaranteed the right to vote, especially in the South, Northern carpetbaggers descend upon the South, seeking to, quote, sponsor or control sometimes inexperienced and sometimes uneducated African American candidates in their bids for office. And remember, former Confederates are disenfranchised until the state ratifies these amendments. The carpetbaggers would seize control of lucrative reconstruction funds available through these offices. They're often joined by Southern, quote, scalawags who had supported Republican Party in the South and were seen locally as traitors. Many former Black slaves in the South did not see eye to eye with freed Northern Blacks of the abolitionist movement. Some Southern African Americans, for example, supported segregation, which they saw as a means of autonomy from whites in everyday life, particularly in the schools, that is going to become, in future decades, such an issue when it comes to integration. And this willingness laid the early foundations of segregation that would persist into the late 1960s for a century to come. There was this, again, push to portray African Americans as being influenced in their vote by northern states, New York, New Jersey. As you can see from this cartoon again, with the caption, "Shoe fly, don't bother me." And so in the late 1860s and 1870s, as former Confederates find themselves disenfranchised, roughly 80% of Southern Republican voters were African American voters. Yet, despite this, no black governors are going to be elected in any of the states. And in only one state, in South Carolina, were African Americans close to gaining their fair share of local offices based on the population. No more than 20% of public posts in the South would be occupied now by elected African Americans during the Reconstruction period. Although this 20% of elected black officials in the South is an extraordinary number when you think about the situation the year before or 2 years before and the decades that will follow. On a federal level, 6% of congressmen were African Americans, a number that would diminish to zero within the decade and would remain at almost zero into the 20th century. Despite these accusations that African American elected officials were illiterate, nearly 80% of African American office holders were literate, but more than a quarter had been free before the war, and many of them had come down to the South from the North as carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers, by the way, if you're unclear about the term, refers to this here, a kind of luggage that looks like a carpet that's bound together, a cloth luggage. It was cheap and ubiquitous in that era. These federal elected officials by the 1880s will vanish completely from the face of the American political system. And there will be perhaps one or two African Americans elected to federal Congress during the first half of the 20th century, but it's not until well into the 1970s that there is a kind of robust representation of African Americans in Congress. This is the period, of course, that the KKK begins to rise. And here again, you can see the kind of targeting of a carpetbagger by the KKK. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, did not have those kinds of white robes that we're familiar with today, or the ritual of lighting the cross. Although certainly the KKK represented Southern white power, it targeted whites as much as it targeted blacks. Any white who was part of the Reconstruction process, part of the occupation of the South, was seen as an enemy. So it can be said that this first KKK, and there will be a number of KKKs in the future history of the United States, was more akin to kind of a Confederate resistance group than the kind of racist organization it is today, which not only stands against African Americans, but as well against immigrants, Catholics, Jews, Asians, anybody who is not essentially a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. The KKK today, as I say, is kind of a super white heritage organization, where in the past, the first KKK arguably had a kind of an agenda that at least certainly I would not give approbation to, but is understandable as, again, a kind of partisan resistance group. And so it took on various guises and various forms that are unfamiliar to us today. Nonetheless, at the bottom of the KKK agenda was the kind of paranoid fear of African American voting power. And remember how large the population of slaves who are now freed were in the Confederacy. So they certainly made up a large proportion of the ballot box power, and even more powerful once, of course, Confederates are banned from voting. So this drives the KKK forward. The problem, of course, was that as Southern states ratified the 14th Amendment, they were now readmitted into the Union. And the Republican majority by the 1870s was facing now renewed competition at the polls from Southern Democrats. As soon as Democrats or Republican governments ratified the 14th Amendment, they were now readmitted into the Union, and Union troops were withdrawn. And so at the same time, former Confederates began to abandon their violent resistance to civil rights and express it in political movements which sought to regain the control of the state legislature. Between 1869 and 1877, the so-called Redeemers, mostly Southern Democrats, state by state, took away majorities from the Republicans and retook control of the South in the process known today as the Redemption. And so in this process, as the Democratic Party began to restore its power in the South, the African American vote started to be regarded as less of a threat, while state governments began to find all sorts of loopholes and inventive ways to restrict African American votes by, for example, by things that did not necessarily involve the color of the voter's skin. For example, poll taxes or property requirements, residence requirements, and so forth, which would, on the books, target a white voter as much as an African American voter, but statistically, more African Americans would fall into that category through that system. They began to, again, restrict African American ability to vote without explicitly prohibiting it. Gerrymandering, a way of kind of redrawing electoral boundary lines where, for example, white populations had a greater voting power in a selective area, reducing those areas where there were a majority of African Americans as well, to kind of gerrymander the results, something that is still being done and contested in the United States as respective governments, kind of respective parties and rulings trying to restructure the borders of voting areas in a way that will favor their party when the final kind of electoral results are calculated and assembled and assigned to various districts. So in the wake of this so-called redemption, eventually there will come an end to Reconstruction, and it's going to, as I say, bring the South back into kind of an autonomous power over itself now, back to its original state, where there is a kind of white rule in the way there had been prior to the Civil War. And it will involve, what's called the fraud of the century. The stolen election of 1876, a talk of shades of the current election that had just occurred in the United States. As Karl Marx said, history does repeat itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. So we're witnessing in our time the farce. The tragedy, of course, is in the election between Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat candidate Samuel Tilden. I won't get into the details of this election, but a number of electors choose to certify the election in their own way, causing this, rather than the way people voted, causing this deadlock in the election that has to be resolved by a committee of the government. 4 states end up being undecided. Oregon, for example, chooses Hayes, but Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida each sent 2 electoral votes to Washington, 1 for each candidate. And so the federal government now has to decide the election. And so a special electoral commission is established. 7 Republicans from Congress, 7 Democrats from the Senate, and 1 Republican appointed Supreme Court justice who is supposed to decide, there's a tie in that committee. The deal in the end for the various Democratic members to, in the end, vote for Rutherford Hayes as president, the Republican candidate, will be the end of Reconstruction. That's the deal they make. And so we have now, with the kind of ending of Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877, Southern Democrats will now certify the Republican president, Rutherford Hayes, if Hayes ends Reconstruction. The KKK, after this, having killed approximately 20,000 people during the Reconstruction era, will start fading away. Back in 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau funding had ceased, and so the Freedmen's Bureau just already had been killed, kind of in the financial appropriations process in Congress. Southern Democrats now gain more power, and they begin to reintroduce black codes. And now no one is going to stop them. And as Hayes ends Reconstruction, the South now begins to introduce a series of what we call Jim Crow laws, limiting African American rights in the South and implementing a very extensive system of segregation. In its wake, in the wake of the redemption and the 1870, in the wake of the 1878 elections, African Americans in the South are now relegated to second-class citizenship by state legislation that called for literacy tests, payment of poll taxes, property qualifications, segregation, without specifically excluding voters on the basis of race, as I already had described. Facilities for voter registration in predominantly black precincts were dismantled. From, I'm sorry, I should have said 1876 election as opposed to 78. Jim Crow, we're not quite sure the origin of that term. There's a kind of jumping Jim Crow, song and dance caricature from the 1840s. It may have come from that, but now the federal government and the U.S. Supreme Court are caught up in this new redemption and begin to back away from its responsibility for civil rights and protection of African Americans, and begin to retreat into this concept of separate but equal segregation, which will be officially endorsed by the Supreme Court in 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court will rule that it is completely constitutional to separate the races as long as both sides get equal access or equal treatment. And just from this illustration between the two drinking fountains, you can see how not equal the separation is. It's so obvious here. You know, it's almost a caricature. And so now, right into the 1960s, Americans will be segregated by race, by law in the South, often by custom and culture in the North, although in the North, segregation cannot be enforced in the way it will be enforced by law in the South. Here you can even see Coca-Cola machines for white customers only. These scenes are ubiquitous south of the Mason-Dixon line. Everywhere there is a kind of enforced segregation of the African Americans from whites that will continue right on the books until LBJ in 1965 will finally pass the Civil Rights Act, which will end all vestiges of segregation. But you can see African Americans were relegated to sit at the back of the bus or in certain seats. In certain jurisdictions, they were required when a white enters to give up their seat if one wasn't available. Lunch counters had separate white or colored entrances. During the civil rights struggle of the 1950s, 1960s, often lunch counters became kind of the focal point of protest, as African Americans would sit down at the lunch counter, demand to be served. Police would be called to arrest them, demonstrations, and so forth. But this really became the symbol of where the end of Reconstruction had taken now the history of race relations in the United States. And so this essentially, we reach a point where, as in the case of this illustration, the Choke 'em Down lunchroom, great title for a diner, is actually making it a point of advertisement that both white and colored are served. But indeed, the two were separate, but not at all equal. And this essentially will characterize a worsening situation for African Americans from that period in Reconstruction. In the decade following the Civil War, where African Americans were actually elected to federal office and were empowered for the first time. All that will be taken away from them, and to this day, race relations in the United States remain an issue that has not been resolved by the Civil War. And I think have argued throughout these lectures, the reason probably they have not been resolved is because, in the very first place, the Civil War was not about freeing African American slaves or about restoring or equalizing race relations and civilizing race relations. And so to this day, it's a problem that has not been resolved and seems to be actually worsening, particularly in the last 4 years of the Trump administration in the United States.